Hello everyone. Today we'll be going over the Relfsson Gambit. This gambit begins with the Scotch game, so e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now going ahead and playing d4. This is not yet the Relfsson Gambit because if black takes, you can take back with the knight, but if black goes ahead and takes, then you go ahead and swing out your bishop, not to here, where this would be the Scotch Gambit, but to here, the Relfsson Gambit. And these two gambits, the Scotch and the Relfsson, are very similar. You obviously start the same, only your bishop moves to a different location. I personally think that the Relfsson Gambit is a little bit more open-ended, and you have a couple more options with it. Before I get into the continuations that you might see, and I'll be covering this move, this move, this move, and this move in this video. So before I get into any of those four continuations, I wanted to mention that this is Chess Geek channel, and it is intended to help you improve at chess. So if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And now let's get right into the gambit. So first, let's go over the variation where your opponent decides to go ahead and play a6. Here you take, because this gambit, you usually will take the pawn back. So you see after black takes, then you take the pawn back, because although this is a gambit, this pawn here, it can always be captured, and that's kind of a difference that you see with other gambits where you trade a pawn for a pawn that cannot be captured, at least currently can't be captured. Here, this pawn can always be captured. So usually in this gambit, you go ahead and get the material back and capture the pawn again, but it's not immediately. So after you trade off the bishop for the knight, you go ahead and capture the pawn, and obviously if trade, then you capture back with the knight, and this is very reasonable. Black has this little pawn issue on the queen side with a double pawn, and black really is so black probably won't castle queenside because of these pawns. So black is going to castle kingside, and none of the pieces have been developed, whereas you can already castle. So this is I would say that white is doing much better in this position. Also, the knight is doing quite a lot, protecting some important areas in the board. Now let's move on to the other variation that you might go ahead and see in your game. If your opponent decides to take out their bishop, then you simply go ahead and castle. And now, if your opponent goes ahead and plays a6, threatening to capture the bishop, then you capture again. And usually in this variation, you do trade your bishop over here for the knight. There is one variation where you pop the bishop back, but for the most part, you do trade. And a lot of times you want to keep your bishops on the board, but here your knights actually do a lot of especially in the early game, they do a lot. So now your opponents are going to capture back. And notice that putting out the bishop here does indeed protect the pawn, which is why we can't capture it immediately. And instead we go ahead and play this move here, hoping to get our knight to this square here where it will, simply put more pressure on the pawn. And if your opponent takes out their own bishop, then notice that now we can simply continue with our plan and develop the knight. And if your opponent moves back the bishop, as we were threatening to capture it, then you can simply go ahead and capture the pawn. If your opponent decides to capture this bishop instead right here, or this knight, my apologies, then you can capture back with the queen, and you're still threatening to capture the bishop, so he will probably back up. But let's say he does back up, capture, and if your opponent captures, you can obviously capture first. Make sure you go ahead and capture with the queen, otherwise your queen would be hanging if you played a move like that. And again, if your opponent takes the knight here, you might initially be thinking of capturing the queen, but actually there's a better move, which is capturing the pawn over here. And the only move that black has is moving the queen here to prevent you from capturing the rook. So you win another pawn, and obviously after you trade the queens, you grab back the bishop. So your king is a little less safe. Your pawns aren't as good, but you do have more material. So benefits and disadvantages for this variation. And if we go back, obviously, if your opponent first grabs the queen, then you grab back with the knight. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the third variation that you might go ahead and see. The third variation is if your opponent takes out their knight, putting pressure on this pawn here. You'll just castle. And if your opponent does indeed, if your opponent grabs the pawn, then notice that you have this nice move here, pinning the knight, and eventually you'll have an idea of doing a move like this and putting and pushing your pawn here where the knight is pinned so that the knight can't move, and you win the piece. So you will get the piece back, at least the material by a pawn. So your opponent might just play a6 again, and this is the variation where instead of capturing, you push the bishop back. The board is a little bit more open. The bishop is no longer on one of these squares. So it's just you have more room, and more room means that the bishop is slightly better. So if your opponent does play this, you simply push back. And if your opponent takes out their bishop, preparing to castle, then you can go ahead and push your pawn. And this is the situation where after your opponent moves their knight, you grab back the pawn. So like I said, you always are going to win the pawn back in this gambit. And obviously you can trade. In fact, if you trade, then you're going to go and have a little, if you trade, then you're going to go and put some pressure on the piece here as well. So this is a good variation, I'd say, for you. So if you go ahead and see your opponent taking out their knight as the second move, or not second move, but as the move after you go ahead and play your bishop over here, then you should be pretty happy with that. It's a fairly nice position for you. Let's go ahead and look at the last variation. The last variation is going ahead and checking you with this move here. You'll simply go ahead and block the check with c3, and now your opponent has an option. If your opponent retreats to here, for example, then you can simply castle and then plan on capturing this pawn back, or you can even just capture the pawn back, which is what I would prefer. So if this happened, then you can capture the pawn back. If your opponent capture, you have capture, and yeah, this is a great position, and again, you want to castle soon. If your opponent instead decides to grab the pawn with the other pawn, and notice that now you're not going to have the material even because your opponent did indeed grab a second pawn, I would recommend grabbing it with the knight. If you grab with the knight, your opponent probably will not capture back with the bishop because your opponent's bishop right now is quite important, pinning a piece, and it's a fairly open game still, and your opponent probably doesn't want to trade off that piece yet. So if this would happen, then your opponent might play a move like this, but for the most part, your opponent could just play some normal developing moves maybe. In which case, or not your queen there, obviously, but your queen here, for example, in which case you can simply castle. And yeah, and you can prepare to play a move like this once you've castled. Let's go ahead and look at the variation that you capture with the pawn, which is the one that I don't prefer as much because now your pawns are a little bit separated and it's not a great position. So I would rather instead going ahead and not doing that. One more variation, which actually is one that I really enjoy playing, is just castling off the right when the game begins, or right when this position appears, which is a little weird because you're giving yet another piece, but then you capture back with the bishop, and bishop, the pair of bishops are very, very important. And notice that you're putting pressure on this, threatening to grab the rook after, so your opponent would have to play a move like this. And then you can kick the knight back, and this is just a fairly happy position. Your queen gets into the game, your pawn gets into the game, and although this is a very open position, for you have your bishops. So open position means that your bishops are worthy, and that's the situation for you. Also, your rook both of your rooks can get into the game very quickly. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I want to mention that if you've made it throughout the whole video, thank you first of all. And also I have a question for you, which is what is your response after e4. So in the first move of the game, let's go ahead and look all the way back. After you see your opponent play e4, what do you play? e5, c5, or d5. One of these three options, or any other option that you play. Maybe you play the French, maybe this move, whatever you play, let me know in the comments below. I'll see you guys in the next video.